Mark, thank you so much for coming along today. I think we've got most people here on time, which is really, really good. I know that sometimes that can be tricky to achieve. I'm going to record this session. So if anyone has any objections, please let me know. I think I can see everyone. Just getting used to this sort of screen. So I'm just going to hit record.
Recording in progress.
Okay, so those who can put their cameras on, please put your camera on, because it helps the presenter to be able to see you. But I understand some people can't, so that's okay as well. If you're, trying to do something else at the same time, or there's a reason why you can't have your camera on. So I've met most of you. I think I've met all of you on, was it Wednesday when we had Lexi present. So my name's Rachel and I'm the support group coordinator. Today we have Merrick joining us. We're so lucky to have Merrick. He's one of our Small Steps presenters, and amongst a lot of other things, I'll let Merrick introduce himself in a moment. He can tell you all about all the wonderful things that he does. So he's going to give us a rundown on the anxiety disorders today. So this is great for learning all about the different anxiety disorders, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to be able to ask Merrick questions. So if you've got any questions about any of the anxiety disorders in preparation to be facilitating a group, you'll be able to ask Merrick. Merrick, when he introduces himself, he'll advise on breaks and how to ask questions during the presentation. So I'll leave that to him. As with Wednesday's presentation, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourselves, and that just helps Merrick to know who's in the room. So we might start with, first one on my screen is Ben. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Rachel. Hi, everybody. I'm Ben. I'm just finished a diploma of counselling. I'm keen to be a counsellor. I want to focus, I suppose, with helping men deal with issues of grief and loss, trauma, and suicide prevention. And I'm here to learn about how to facilitate and be a part of group therapy as part of my learning, and I'm looking forward to contributing. Thank
Wonderful.
You.
Thank you, Ben. And Ria?
Hi everyone, my name is Ria. I'm currently a second year psychology student at UNSW. And I thought this was a great opportunity to just get some practical experience with people with mental health illnesses, and get to learn more about how to interact with people with different illnesses. Thank you.
Thanks, Ria. Nice to see you again. And Harley?
Hey, good morning. I just recently graduated with my diploma of counselling as well, and I've always sort of took an interest to this sort of stuff, and throughout my life I've just naturally been somebody that people can come and talk to, and I've always found it fascinating hearing people's stories, and I find it enriches my life as well. And I'm here to just learn whatever I can and take it into the field and start practicing it. So thank you.
Thanks Harley. And Mahmoud?
Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Good morning as well. My name is Mahmoud. I'm currently commencing my 4th year honours in psychology, and I'm undertaking this opportunity to also further gain more experience. I've already been facilitating at another organisation as well, but I thought it would be even better to just take part in other organisations and learn other practice steps. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I think I've got everyone. It's just a different view when Merrick shares his screen, but as far as I can see, that is everyone that's with us at the moment. So I'm going to hand it over to Merrick, and he can introduce himself and launch into his presentation. Thank you, Merrick.
Thanks, Rachel. And hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Nice to get some introductions, hear everyone's interests and backgrounds, and nice to have a few, different stages of your kind of mental health careers. I'm going to talk to you today about anxiety disorders in a bit more detail and cover a little bit about the criteria for anxiety disorders, the prevalence, also the kind of most effective treatments, why those are the case. And we'll go through each one kind of one at a time. I am happy for people to ask questions kind of as we go. I think it's always good to have a spot for questions. So if you want to pop stuff in the chat, I can bring it up as I get to it. Or if you want to ask a question on the mic, just use the raise hand function and I'll get to you as soon as I can. But yeah, do please feel free to ask questions as we go. A little bit about me. I'm a PhD candidate in psychology at Macquarie University. I did my undergrad, my honours, my masters at Macquarie as well. I work in various roles in mental health as well, being academic tutor, research assistant, and of course being a facilitator of the Small Steps program here for Wayahead. We might as well get straight into it. We'll start with a bit of an overview and prevalence of anxiety disorders. And anxiety disorders are prevalent within quite a high proportion of the population, 13+% as of 2017, 2018. And we can see on the screen what those, kind of numbers are made up of. We'll talk a little bit more later on about how things like OCD are no longer considered anxiety disorders specifically, and in the DSM-5 have their own criteria. But we're going to talk about them as in the context of anxiety disorders today because they're treated in a very similar way. So we'll mention that when we get to it. But yeah, these are kind of the main ones that we're going to focus on today. Comorbidity with anxiety disorders is very high. So it's really common to have more than one, or it's also really common to have major depressive disorder as well. And this is particularly common when early symptoms of anxiety go untreated. And so, this early intervention is really, really important when we're dealing with anxiety disorders, so we don't get, second anxieties coming into play, major depressive disorder coming into play, and so on. Our treatment is quite effective, and we're going to talk about treatments at the end and also a little bit kind of throughout each. We're going to focus today on CBT, but as everyone studying counselling or kind of psych would know, there are a range of other treatments available. And research is kind of continually ongoing to understand different types of treatments, so things like DBT, things like ACT, and those sort of things. But we will focus on CBT today just because it has the strongest empirical evidence base at the moment. Treatment is quite effective, particularly if we get in early. And I think that's a really important thing, and something particularly in our Small Steps programs that we try and preach as much as possible. Is that, if you get onto these things early, you have a really, really great chance of, navigating your anxiety, managing your anxiety, and going on to live a very normal and fulfilling life. So I'll just check that I've got my little chat box open in case questions pop up. As I said, feel free to jump in at any point. But I will kick off with generalized anxiety disorder. And so generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by pervasive worry about day-to-day concerns. And these are things that, non-anxious people would rarely consider as issues, being particularly worried about, getting to work or your financial situation or the likelihood of becoming ill in a kind of way that, a lot of other people don't experience or experience in a very, very minor way. And this is, kind of the classic worry-wart anxiety that it was called a few years ago. And it's accompanied by motor tension and autonomic activity. So, your classic heart rate increases and the physiological experiences that go along with those worries too. Common onset age is late teens and early 20s, but it can start as young as pre-primary school. And it is one of those anxiety disorders that we're starting to see come up in younger and younger people. As I mentioned before, some of the kind of common domains of worry are things like work, the ability to work, your ability to perform well at work or school as well, university, kind of any context like that. Your family, your relationships within your family, your financial situation, illnesses, and the kind of just general inability to cope with day-to-day life, day-to-day stresses, day-to-day events. One thing that really characterizes GAD is this, what we call apprehensive expectation. You're always expecting that something bad can happen at any moment. And it's this real kind of worst case scenario, consistent thinking. And in terms of the kind of diagnostic criteria, it has to be occurring more days than not for at least 6 months. in order to be considered generalized anxiety disorder. One thing that's really common with this kind of apprehensive expectation is this difficulty controlling the worry that bad things are going to happen. And we see this kind of snowball of worries start to happen. So it might be, I'm really worried about, how I'm performing at work, leading into I'm worried about how I speak to people at work, leading into I'm worried about even going to work at all. And these things start to build up and become really, really debilitating over time. Some common behaviors that we see with generalized anxiety disorder, and these are kind of across most age ranges, but maybe more so in the younger populations in our kind of primary school, high school people. We see a lot of excessive reassurance seeking. So asking the same questions over and over again to get that reassurance or validation. Are you sure that I'm going to be good enough to finish year 9? Are you sure that I'm going to, these sort of things, asking the same questions over and over again. And a lot of what if questions. And this is really about this kind of worst case scenario thinking, what if I miss the bus? What if I'm late? What if I get my homework wrong and I get in trouble? What if I, don't perform well enough and I get kicked out of school? And then the snowball you can see kind of continues from there. So they're really common behaviors, again, for people of all ages, but especially in young people where they're, sometimes more vocal in expressing concerns. And, we see some people suppress these behaviors, particularly as they get older. Talking a bit more specifically about the diagnostic criteria, we mentioned before about the idea of symptoms being present for more days than not over a 6-month period. And that is the really defining feature of generalized anxiety disorder. In terms of these symptoms for adults, it is 3 or more of the following 6. So restlessness, feeling tense on edge, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating or having your mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, as I mentioned before, that kind of associated motor activity, and poor sleep. So this can be having a hard time falling asleep, having a hard time staying asleep, waking up in the middle of the night, not being able to get back to sleep, and those sort of things. And you'll note that here for children, only one of these symptoms needs to be present for that more days than not over 6 months period for a diagnosis. It is one of the more common anxiety disorders, and it tends to affect roughly 3% of the population at any one time over a 12-month period. And that is based on data from the same set we looked at the start, so the 2017-2018 survey in Australia. In terms of treating generalized anxiety disorder, a lot of the strategies, again, I mentioned will focus on CBT. Some that are quite specific to generalized anxiety is a lot about this kind of worry awareness and a kind of psychoeducation focus of, these things that you tend to be concerned about or tend to worry about, a lot of other people don't actually think about. And it seems like you put a lot of emphasis on these certain things. Again, making sure it's done in a warm and sensitive way, not in a dismissive way. But it is really important to have people understand that a lot of these worries are, quite specific to them in certain situations. Then you can move into kind of cognitive restructuring, so helping people change their beliefs about these worries, rather than having a focus on, everything that could go wrong. Let's look at the gray areas in between, stopping that black and white thinking. And so a range of cognitive restructuring techniques that some of you, or I assume most of you are at least aware of in a certain capacity. Looking at anxiety management strategies more from a kind of physiological point of view, so breathing exercises, relaxation, mindfulness, those sort of, more kind of physiological response reduction strategies. And also worry exposure. And so, thinking about kind of classic exposure therapy of gently exposing people to some of the, difficult situations or some of the situations that cause them a lot of concern. Let's see what happens if you turn up to work 10 minutes late. And then everyone realizes that, no one even realized I was late. I didn't get in trouble, whatever. It's actually all good. Those kind of things, giving people, a little bit of an example of what it's like to be in situations that they might have fear about. Again, using the classic kind of exposure therapy technique of making sure it's not too big of a jump, making sure it's appropriate, sensitive, and caring in that time too. All right. Do we have any questions about this particular section before we move on into social phobias? No problem. If not, I saw someone popped in on the way through. So hi to our new person in the room.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
Hi, no problem. Nice to meet you, Lisa.
Nice to meet you.
So we just wrapped up a first anxiety disorder that we're going to talk about, and we've got quite a few more to go, so you have not missed too much yet at all. We're going to talk about social phobia at the moment. The main thing that we talk about in terms of social phobia is this idea of being more than just shy. It's actually, rather than being, a little bit introverted or a little bit, tentative in social situations, it's a real kind of core significant fear or anxiety about being in social situations. And the core fear of this is negative evaluation. So fear that you're going to act in a certain way that other people aren't going to like, whether they're going to think you're incompetent, weird, you're going to embarrass yourself, you're not going to be cool enough, smart enough, whatever it might be. The core fear is about that negative evaluation and thus being rejected from the social situation. These can be things like classic kind of social interactions, like having conversations, meeting new people, or even hanging out with people you know quite well. But also it can be things like even eating or drinking in public, of course, performing in front of other people. And we think about, doing a speech in front of your uni cohort or your boss or whatever as a really kind of big example of times where even people without social phobia might experience a lot of these kind of symptoms because, that kind of performance anxiety is quite common. In terms of the eating or drinking in front of other people, we'll come back to some of these things in a bit. But a lot of that is around the physical symptoms that present itself. You start shaking and you start doing these sort of things that you can't control with the anxiety, which makes the situation worse. The person with social phobia expects to be judged negatively or expects to embarrass himself, expects not to be smart enough. And it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is the cycle that we really need to break in terms of people who are dealing with social phobia or social anxiety disorder, as it's also called. And this is something that, kind of strengthens over time, particularly if these symptoms are not addressed. A person will actively avoid feared situations or endure them with great anxiety and distress because they're always overestimating the probability and the cost of negative outcomes. So they're always thinking that these things where they're going to embarrass themselves or make a fool of themselves are going to happen more often than they actually will, and also to a more severe extent than they actually will as well. So that's what we mean by the kind of probability and the cost both being overestimated. I mentioned before about being more than just shy and being more than just a kind of introvert if you are someone with social phobia. And a really common telltale sign here is if you're socially anxious, even around people that you know really well and people that you're really familiar with. Because someone who's quite shy will, have a tough time breaking into a social dynamic or social network, but over time become quite comfortable and quite settled. Someone with social phobia will not. And will continue to have this anxiety even around people they know quite well. And that's a really common telltale sign that we see. The kind of cost of social phobia is really large because it causes, clinically significant distress. It causes a lot of avoidance of situations. Means people are either impaired going to work or socializing or just don't go altogether. And so it's associated with the failure to achieve social or occupational potential. You stop going to work, you stop going to your tutorials, you avoid getting promotions because you don't want to deal with the anxiety of the process. And so all of these things are really common ways in which people, potentially don't achieve what they're capable of achieving, and the anxiety is really clouding that for them. In terms of prevalence, it is one of the most common, more common than GAD, and approximately 5% of the population at any one time over a 12-month period here in Australia will experience, social phobia, social anxiety disorder. So the mean age of onset is around 15 years old, so it's a bit younger than our GAD, and again, it can be really, really young as well, something that we do see high school, primary school, even pre-primary. It's often really hard to identify a key event that sets it off, and it usually develops quite gradually. And you can see, again, with this kind of early intervention focus, how important it is, particularly for something that doesn't have an event that, sets it off or is really commonly associated with the start of that anxiety. Physiological symptoms of, this kind of classic fight or flight response. We see all of the, increased sympathetic nervous system arousal, the kind of classic motor activity increases, all of the visible anxiety symptoms that we think of, the sweating, the blushing, the shaking, the potential dizziness, the, butterflies in the stomach, all the way through to nausea, and all of those things. And I mentioned before about how, some of these things can have a really cyclical nature. If you're someone who's anxious about doing a presentation in front of people, and then you start shaking and people can see you, jiggling your palm cards, and you start sweating and you're visibly blushing, you go, oh no, I'm making a fool of myself in front of all these people. It gets worse and worse. And so this kind of cycle of visible symptoms is really, really awful and really nasty for someone dealing with social phobia. And that's the same with things like eating in public and those sort of things as well, because, you start shaking and you start spilling your food, and then you embarrass yourself, and then you fulfill that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that we mentioned before. So it's really, really sad and really, really difficult to navigate. There's also really high levels of what we call anticipatory anxiety. A lot of anxiety in the build up to an event. And then after the event, the person will go home and replay every moment and go, I can't believe I did that. I should have done this. People, I think, I'm going to think X, Y, and Z of me because of this. And again, overestimating, the cost of some of those decisions, thinking, people must have thought I was the biggest fool, and people at the party or the office would just not even realize probably what they did at all. Again, which is another really difficult, characteristic of social phobia. These are some examples of situations that are commonly avoided. So parties and social gatherings, as you can imagine. Public speaking, eating or drinking in public, generally just crowds and busy places, whether these are, sporting events or public transport or, even just going to the city, like all sorts of crowds and busy places are generally avoided. Thinking about the fears that underlie these situations, so appearing foolish or looking anxious, seeming kind of that odd or inept, not socially competent, is a common one to avoid parties and stuff. Public speaking, again, is a lot about looking anxious and the visible symptoms we spoke about, as well as just saying something foolish and having a lot of people kind of all eyes on you, very much that kind of spotlight effect. The shaking hands and the kind of visible symptoms for eating and drinking in public, and then just kind of general scrutiny from crowds. So, seeming being the weird one on the bus or the train and those sort of things as well. Here's some kind of typical cognitions that you could imagine someone with social anxiety having in these moments, particularly with the kind of social situations. What if I can't say anything? What if I don't have anything to add? What if I answer a question in a really weird way? What if people don't think I fit in? And then if I do these things, people are going to think less of me. People will think I'm incompetent. They're not going to like me. And, those kind of cycles of this bad thing could happen and this would be the outcome. And then this bad thing could happen as a result. And so, yeah, I'll let you kind of read those examples on the screen there of some typical cognitions. And I'm sure you can think of many on your own that would kind of fit on that slide as well, just based on what we've spoken about and with your own education as well. So when we talk about particular CBT strategies to address social phobia, it's a lot around reducing the fear of negative evaluation. So helping someone understand, first of all, that people aren't putting as much weight on these thoughts or situations as you are, and a bit of kind of psychoeducation in that space. But also helping people get to, the core issue. Doing speeches is obviously something that causes you a lot of anxiety. We need to do a bit of exposure and stuff working through giving people spaces to practice their speeches, get more confident and so on. but also, trying to get to the core of that fear, talk about what it's like to do speeches. If they can remember situations in which they were actually really good at speeches, what they might have been good, or what reasons might they have been good. Maybe they were really prepared, they were really comfortable, whatever. And so navigating both the fear of negative evaluation and providing that kind of exposure therapy along the same time. And again, teaching anxiety management strategies for the physical responses. Again, our breathing exercises, our mindfulness, our relaxation, and so on. Okie doke. So 2 down. I think we might do one more and then take a quick break. So again, opportunity for questions if anyone has them. I'll take the opportunity to have some water.
Merrick, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
So you talked a lot about the physical symptoms that are associated with social phobia. For our volunteers, are going to be facilitating support groups. So if they have someone in the group who is exhibiting those symptoms, what do you suggest they do? Do they draw attention to it? Do they ignore those symptoms? What do you think would be best?
That's a really good question. I think that's something that you're likely to see a lot in support groups. The first main thing is definitely don't draw attention to it in front of other people, because as soon as you highlight that, it's going to kind of make that spotlight even bigger on that person, and it'll make it really uncomfortable. One thing that you can do, which can be quite nice, is in a moment where you get one-on-one or at the end, you could even just say, like, you looked a little bit, uncomfortable or a little bit nervous today. I just want to say that, even by arriving and contributing, it was really awesome. And hopefully, next week, you feel a bit more comfortable, or hopefully next week you can, bring some questions and kind of encourage people to take those next steps to involve themselves even further. It's really important not to say, you looked like really anxious or you looked really uncomfortable. So as to say, like, it was really noticeable. You could just say, I noticed a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of, nervousness. And that's okay, just being that kind of gentle, soft amount, just not being really extreme with the language you use. But again, making sure that's one-on-one when you're having that conversation. And then, they might have questions for you that they didn't want to ask in the group because they're a bit uncomfortable. And then you navigate those, and then they get questions answered, feel comfortable, feel more positive, and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's how I would tackle it in that kind of group situation. But yeah, really good question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Merrick.
No worries. When talking about specific phobias, I'm sure you all know what specific phobias are, and we can of course think about some classic examples, spiders and heights and all those things. So I won't labor the details of these too much, but effectively it's just an intense and persistent fear reaction to a particular stimulus, and it has to be to the extent that it causes social, occupational, interpersonal, or emotional disruption to a significant extent. The person who has social phobia will recognize that their reaction is excessive or unreasonable. It is, people are very aware about the extent of their phobias and how kind of, excessive they are. And so exposure to that feared stimulus is going to result in avoidance always, or endured with really intense anxiety. Similar to our social phobia and social situations, this is going to be the same with someone who's phobic of spiders or heights being in that situation. Generally, they're going to avoid, or if they can't avoid, it's going to be a really intense and anxious response. People who have phobias also develop what we call fear of the fear, where they start to actually develop a fear and an aversion to the anxiety that the stimulus evokes rather than the anxiety in itself. And this is that kind of classic conditioned response where someone goes, oh, I'm really worried that I'm going to start feeling like this when I am around, heights or around spiders and that sort of thing. It often begins in childhood, but incidence peaks during midlife, and it is really prevalent. So, 8% of the Australian population, it ranges from kind of 3 up to 15% of the population worldwide. So, is very, very common. Heights in animals are two of the most common. And, again, these might be different types of animals. Some people with dogs, spiders, snakes, and they don't even necessarily have to be dangerous animals either. Birds, really common as well. They are persistent unless they are treated, and many people don't get treatment. Many people just think, I'm going to be good if I can avoid it. And a lot of people, think that avoiding it is going to help the impairment. But as we know, high avoidance behavior actually tends to amplify anxiety, and this is no different for phobias. So it is really common for these things to get addressed. And a lot of the time people go, I can avoid heights, I can avoid this and that. But it's, life is long. We get in situations that we're not expecting all the time. So I think it is, really important that we change the mindset around, I can just avoid it and it's fine, to know, let's really work through this thing, because you never know what situations you're going to find yourself in. It's more common in males than females as well in terms of prevalence. We have a few different kind of subtypes. So thinking about animals, natural environments, blood and injury or injection. And this is a particularly interesting one because it means that a lot of people don't go and get medical help. So if you think about someone who's, scared of injections, for example, it means they might not go and get the vaccine, which means that they're putting themselves at risk of, getting ill, or, people who have to get stitches might avoid going to the doctor to get stitches because they're so terrified of it, and then their wounds get infected and stuff like that. So this is one that really needs to be worked through because it's obviously has a very, potentially detrimental outcome, like maybe more so than some of the other ones. Situational, these are our kind of enclosed places, kind of claustrophobic type stuff. Others include things like vomiting or illness. And then these things, as I mentioned before, become the kind of fear itself, the kind of anxiety that you're about to get anxious in the situation. This is my favorite part where we get to talk about all of the different specific phobias because there is so many of them. I'm sure you've all heard of arachnophobia. There's noctophobia, which is a fear of nighttime. I don't know how to pronounce this one, but it's a fear of cooking. There's also pogonophobia, which is a fear of beards. Venus trophophobia is a fear of beautiful women. And this one I can't believe is actually real. And this word, whatever that word is a fear of long words, and I did not make this up. So here's just a few examples of, the names of specific phobias, and you'll find that there are hundreds and hundreds of names for specific things, but typically they lump into those categories that we looked at before. So kind of animals, natural environments, situations, injury, and other. Our treatment is really similar to social phobia, as you can imagine. So real focus on exposure therapy, and you would imagine that if someone had a phobia of spiders, the first sessions you would talk about, the fear of spiders, maybe what it's like to be in the same room as a spider, maybe say, what are the responses that you feel? Then after a few sessions of that, you might say, how would you feel if there was a spider in the room right now? Maybe you'd get pictures of spiders and move them around, just really gradually getting someone used to the idea. You then might go to a situation where there's, a spider in a jar on the other side of the room, walk around, see how the person's doing, gradually working up to the point of having someone feeling comfortable with a spider on the wall in the room they're in. You can see how each of those steps is really sensitive to making sure that someone is not being exposed to something too stressful too early. And you could also imagine how this might be done with other phobias. So for people who are scared of, boats, for example, it might be similar start, talking about what it's like to be around them, then maybe, walking half the way to the ferry one day and then a little bit further the next day, and some of those sort of things. So the exposure therapy is really, really important here. The goals of treatment are to reduce this kind of fear of the fear, as we spoke about. So have people feel comfortable, not only dealing with the thing that causes the phobia, but also the kind of anxiety about the anxiety itself. Dealing with the avoidance, of course, helping people, get into treatment rather than thinking that avoidance is the answer. And also dealing with some of that anticipatory anxiety around, knowing that you have to go to a wildlife park and you're scared of snakes, and that anticipatory anxiety that's going to be building up to that event the whole time. Awesome. I think we'll take a quick break here. Unless anyone has questions, feel free to jump in with a question now. But what we might do is just take 5 minutes and then meet back at, 10:42. Yeah, we might do that if that's all good with everyone.
All good. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay, I think everyone should be back, or I hope everyone's back. And so we'll keep pushing on. Hopefully you enjoyed those first couple of sections. It's a lot of information to go through in a short amount of time. I do appreciate that. But we'll keep going with the last three that we're going to cover for today. And again, as always, feel free to jump in with a question at any point. I'm more than happy to take questions and have some conversations and yeah, do that at any point. Next, we're going to talk about panic disorder and agoraphobia, and we'll see why we're kind of going to talk about them together in a moment. So panic disorder is really characterized by recurring unexpected panic attacks. And I'm sure you know what panic attacks kind of consist of, but it's, overwhelming sense of fear and often involves being dizzy or fainting, potentially choking, having shortness of breath. This kind of smothering sensation, increased heart rate and palpitations, fear of dying or losing control. And a lot of people, after having a heart attack, after having a panic attack, think they're having a heart attack or some really extreme event. And so people who have panic attacks go on to become concerned about the implications of future attacks, that it's going to be, the next one's going to be a heart attack, or I'm going to start, falling apart. And so this constant concern really plays into panic disorder, and the kind of recurrence of these panic attacks also creates a lot of concern about the implications of future panic attacks. Avoidance as a result of attacks, what we mean here is situations in which panic attacks have occurred in the past. For example, whether it was in a shopping center or on the golf course, if you've had a panic attack in a certain situation, you're likely to avoid that situation as a result of that. Agoraphobia here is anxiety about places or situations which might be difficult to escape in the event of having a panic attack. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but it's about, getting in situations where you might not be able to help yourself or feel like you can kind of escape. A lot of people think agoraphobia is, people who just don't leave the house. And, whilst that is a common symptom of agoraphobia, it doesn't tell the whole story. And so it's this idea of, being caught in situations where you might have a panic attack and then you might not be able to get out of them. So hence panic disorder typically occurs before agoraphobia. And agoraphobia is characterized less by a fear of certain situations and more kind of by the fear of having a panic attack. And again, it's just similar to what we said before about the fear of the fear. And it really becomes this kind of conditioned response. Both occur in about 2 to 3% of the population at any time period over 12 months. So here is all of the kind of common symptoms associated with panic attacks come from the kind of physical point of view. I mentioned a few of these before. Some new ones, kind of depersonalization, so not feeling like you're within yourself. Derealization, not being sure if it's even actually happening, and having that real kind of, beyond confusion about the situation, whether you're sure it's even occurring. Pins and needles was one we didn't mention before, and then some other things like muscle tension, blurry vision, and really kind of rapid hot or cold flushes, or both as well. These are things that people commonly think are occurring when panic attacks occur. And this is actually a really common way of finding out that someone has panic disorder, because they might present to a hospital or an emergency situation thinking one of these many different things. And then, through tests, they'll see that they're not having a heart attack. And then, further work and diagnosis might lead towards a panic disorder diagnosis. Of course, not always, but that is one way in which we find out. So these are some common thoughts that people have or kind of misrepresent their panic symptoms to be. We mentioned that people avoid situations which they've had panic attacks in before, or might expect themselves to have panic attacks in too. So it doesn't always have to be a place where they have occurred, but generally a place where they think it might be possible that it could happen. So public transport, driving, crowded places, shopping centers, heights, and then generally like being too far from home, being alone, being too far from help, and lifts in enclosed spaces. And you can see how this plays into the kind of agoraphobia of being in a situation where you're not able to get help. You're not close enough to your house, you're not close enough to your family or friends or your support network and things like that too. So when we think about some kind of safety behaviors that people might perform when we're in situations that are unavoidable. So, say someone has panic disorder, agoraphobia, and has to be in a situation like a shopping center where they really don't want to be, or they think they're having a really hard time of escaping, they might perform some of these behaviors, and these can be real important indicators, what we call safety behaviors. So they might be clinging to a friend or companion the whole time. They might be talking to themselves or talking to other people, or just generally doing things to try and distract themselves. They might consume alcohol or other drugs in a way to, distract themselves or deal with the anxiety and the stress. They might carry, phones, carry medication, carry religious items. And, there's a lot of people who will, rub their beads or have something around their neck, or particular things. Obviously differs depending on the religion. And you also might see that these people are kind of constantly scanning for exits, or constantly making sure they're near an exit, and keeping close to one's car as well. So in terms of the kind of CBT treatments for these, psychoeducation plays a really, really big role here, particularly for those people who might be misrepresenting their symptoms and thinking something else is going on. And of course, it's done so in a way where, it is completely destigmatized, and it's said, just because you didn't have a heart attack doesn't mean that this isn't really important and something that we really need to deal with. And so really navigating the language around that space where someone, might be, but it felt worse than that, and saying, there's no worse than that when we come to panic attacks. They are the way they are, and they are really severe for a reason, and we have to kind of work through those. And then, some of the other things that we've already mentioned, of course, like anxiety management strategies. These are really important here because of the really physical nature of panic attacks and panic disorder. So again, teaching people how to relax, how to control the breath, and, mindfulness sort of stuff is really, really important here. And having tips and tricks you can do in the moment to reduce the heart rate. Things like what we call box breathing, where, breathe in for 2 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, out for 2 seconds, hold for 2 seconds. I'm sure different variations of these types of things. They're really important for people with panic disorder and agoraphobia to have in the toolbox. Exposure therapy. So again, confronting situations, having someone go back to the golf course if it was a place they had a panic attack in a year ago. And particularly for agoraphobia, making sure that they are getting, in situations, again, slowly, respectfully, in the right kind of timing and pacing. And cognitive restructuring, again, which we thought about before, trying to reduce the anxiety about the fear of the situation and the fear of the fear, by engaging in some more realistic talk, some more positive talk, and those sort of things. Okay, so we've got, I think, 2 to go, I believe. And then we're going to talk about some kind of treatment stuff more generally, a bit of a kind of broad overview, and also where the kind of research is heading in the future. OCD, I'm sure you all know what OCD is, but we'll break it into the 2 kind of sections. So we've got obsessions and compulsions. So our obsessions are unwanted, unpleasant, intrusive, persistent thoughts, images, or kind of behavioral impulses that are really intrusive and inappropriate and cause really significant distress when they come in. Now, these are not excessive worries about a real life problem. And this is something that's really important distinction. These are things that are, really different to someone's normal train of thought, not indicative of their personality or character, usually. And they can be really intense, really severe thoughts or images and things like that. And we'll talk about some specifics in a moment. Generally, the way that these are dealt with is a person tries to ignore them or suppress them through neutralizing it with some other thought or some other action. And this is what our compulsions are. Before we talk about those, some really common obsessions include harm to oneself. So this might be kind of relating to germs, contamination, and those sort of things, or harm to oneself or others in a kind of violent way. So thinking about hurting oneself, thinking about killing people that you love or hurting people that you love, inappropriate thoughts involving religious figures, inappropriate sexual thoughts, so thoughts about, sexual behaviors with minors and things like that. And what's really important to note, especially, that is obviously a very, very intense thought and something that's difficult to navigate. These thoughts are also repulsive to the individuals having them. And that's something that's really important to note. These are inconsistent thoughts with their sense of self. And that's why they cause so much great distress. Because, if you think of yourself as a person with strong morals and strong values, and then you have thoughts about, hurting people you love or inappropriate sexual thoughts, you start to think, well, I'm not the person who I think I am at all. And it causes a lot of upset. So it's really important to know that the person having these thoughts also thinks these are repulsive, and helping the person separate the intrusive thoughts and the obsessions from who they are as a person is a really key part of treatment here. Often more than one obsession is present as well, and that's a really important thing to note. And often more than one compulsion is present too, and we'll talk about that here. So our compulsions are the behaviors or thoughts people have to try and neutralize the obsessive thoughts or the obsessions that people have. And they must be kind of conducted according to certain rules that apply in a routine. And the reason they have to be applied in this sort of routine is because they have to be performed specifically to reduce the impact of the obsessive thought. And so these behaviors or mental acts or thoughts, whatever the compulsion is, are all geared around preventing or reducing the distress or preventing a dreaded event from occurring. That should say event there, I apologize. So, if someone has a thought that they're going to hurt someone else and they have to, tap the table 6 times to make sure that bad thing doesn't happen, it has to be conducted in that certain way in order for it to be effective to neutralize that thought. Of course, these things can grow and get more extreme. They might tap the table 9 times and have to tap the table and then say a certain phrase or passage, and they can definitely get worse over time. But it is important that, there's a real kind of structure and real routine around these things. The behaviors and mental acts might be associated with the obsession. The compulsions may match the obsession, or they might not be connected in any sort of realistic way. And typically what characterizes the compulsions here is that they are excessive. And so, some of them might be washing their hands 12 times if they're concerned about, be it germs or be it something really unrelated to germs. So as I mentioned before, people often present with more than one type of compulsion. So it might be compulsive washing, again, sometimes associated with fears of contamination, sometimes not. Checking behaviors, so, making sure that every PowerPoint in the house is turned off before you go to bed, and then checking 3 times, making sure that every door or window, is locked and bolted before you go to bed. Those are kind of examples of checking behaviors. And again, might be associated with potential harm or might not. Repeating numbers, words, or actions. So, those are, certain things that you have to count or say or tap or clap or, and, kind of common, I guess, kind of pop psychology depictions of OCD have these things most commonly. Ordering, so having a need for things to be in a certain order or certain kind of structure in your house or in your workspace or those sort of things. And obsessional slowness is one as well, where, you have to do a task in a very particular order and it has to be, meticulously planned and laid out and done in a certain way. Otherwise, it's not good enough or not appropriate enough or not going to, quell that compulsion that is happening. The main, I guess, takeaway from this that is really important is that any behavior, be it tapping a table or just thinking about certain numbers or washing or whatever it might be, any behavior has the potential to become a compulsion, to become a ritual. And it's really important to note that, whether they're associated with the obsession or not, any behavior can become one of these. So in OCD, the obsessive thought and the compulsive behavior become really strongly linked because, it is the person who, the behavior that the person conducts that gets rid of that really bad thought. And when, we're dealing with thoughts that are so distressing and so upsetting, you can see how strongly those links come together. Much like our phobias, our client understands that the obsessions and compulsions are excessive and unreasonable. They're very aware of the fact that, I have to wash my hands 12 times. I know it's weird. I know it's over the top, but I just have to do it. Otherwise, X, Y, Z. Tends to appear in adolescence to early adulthood. It can occur in young children. It's really difficult with young children because they often don't know why they're doing the things that they're doing. People only kind of become cognizant of the fact that it reflects OCD around late primary school often. So it more commonly appears after that, but it can appear younger than that too. It is highly comorbid with other anxieties and depressive disorders. So at the start, we mentioned that it's really common for people when they have anxiety to develop multiple anxieties or to develop depression as well. OCD is a really kind of common second anxiety. And it is, often you rarely see someone who has OCD who doesn't have another anxiety as well. It occurs in about 2% of the population at any one time over a 12-month period. So a little bit less prevalent than some of the other ones we've spoken about, but still really important to navigate. And of course, due to the great burden that OCD has, its importance in navigating, treating, and especially treating early is quite clear, I can imagine. People can be diagnosed with either obsessions or compulsions, but they commonly present together. So people might have obsessions without compulsions, and that's about 5 to 15% of people, but 85% plus present with both. And also having compulsions without obsessions is very rare. And there is a range of other disorders that navigate some of the more behavioral things. People who might be, pulling their hair out constantly or things like that. There's specific disorders for those sort of things. They wouldn't fall under OCD, and they have their own names in the DSM-5. So looking at treatment here, it's common to use SSRIs, antidepressant medication, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to get someone to a space where they're able to engage with CBT or other, psychological treatments. That is also the case for the other disorders that we've spoken about today. And at the extreme ends of anxiety, for all of the other ones we've spoken about, SSRIs can be used. But generally it is used to get someone to be at a point where they can engage with a, psychological or behavioral intervention like your CBT or, other ones if a place is doing things like ACT or DBT and so on. Psychoeducation, again, really important. And I mentioned before how important it is to, tell someone that, these obsessions are not you, and really creating a separation between, this is not a part of your personality. This is something completely separate, and you shouldn't feel bad for this, because of course people are going to feel bad for that. And it's really, unfair. Exposure and response prevention. So this is, very much our very structured exposure therapy. Really, really important to have structure and have these behavioral experiments as well. So what I mean by these is, at home, I'm going to make sure that a certain situation plays out, and you're not allowed to tap the table in response. And, I might have to get your mum or brother or whoever it is to kind of watch over you and make sure you don't, kind of cave and perform the compulsion. Make sure it's in a really kind of controlled, safe environment, so they can, feel as comfortable as possible not performing the compulsion. But it is really important to have, other family members involved. For example, like if I was had obsessive thoughts about something and my compulsion behavior was taking this water bottle off the table, it would be a situation whereby, we'd have the water bottle has to stay on the table. and I might need, you know, Rachel's help to be in the room to make sure that I don't take it off, because as soon as Rachel leaves, I'm getting rid of that water bottle, of course. So that's what I mean by getting other people involved in this sort of treatment. It's really important. And this is geared around disconfirmation of the core fear. So effectively showing people that the obsessive thought isn't going to play out. Like, you know, you're not going to, you know, have your, you know, car broken into, you know, at X time, or, you know, your family members are not going to get hurt on the train home from work or whatever it is. And, you know, whilst we can't promise anything, you know, 99.9% of the time, we're not going to see that core fear realized, because they're often very extreme and very excessive. So it's all about disconfirming those core fears. And that's what our CBT is geared around doing, is showing people that, you know, even without the compulsions, generally the bad thing is not going to happen. So I mentioned before that I would touch on this. OCD was previously classified as an anxiety disorder, and now has its own category in the DSM-5, the most recent edition of the DSM. So it now has its own category, obsessive compulsive unrelated disorders. And I mentioned there was some other disorders that were more kind of compulsive behavior, like our hair pulling, skin picking, things like hoarding and body dysmorphia also fall into this new category. There was some debate as to whether this was the right thing to do or not. And a lot of the reason behind this debate is that OCD is obviously treated in a very similar way to anxiety disorders, but it has a really few kind of distinct differences to anxiety disorders as well. So it wasn't a universally accepted or appreciated change necessarily, but you can understand the rationale behind it, you know, both being in and also both and being out. PTSD is the final one that we're going to talk about today. And so I will, again, give an opportunity for anyone to have a question if anyone has one.
I suppose this is more a comment. As you're going through the disorders, I can see so much overlap between the disorders. So often in our groups, we get people which don't fit neatly into that box of one of the anxiety disorders. And especially when you're talking about panic attacks, and I was thinking about the people that present with health anxiety in the groups, or what do they used to call them? Hypochondriacs or something like that. With that link between those panic attacks and that also is it's really, you see a lot of that in the groups. And thank you so much for your explanation of OCD, because I think it's so misunderstood out in the community, and how debilitating it is and how frightening to the person those obsessive thoughts can be. And it's not a reflection of their own value system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important, especially of how trivialized OCD can become. You know, we all know someone who says, I'm a little bit OCD about this. And it's like, well, actually, it's really scary, OCD, and we don't want to make light of it. So I think, you know, and as you say, the impact it has and how debilitating it can be, I think it's really important to improve the understanding of what's actually involved.
And also in our groups, we do welcome people with OCD, and we do have OCD specific groups, but people with OCD are also welcome to join our anxiety groups. As people with hoarding, often we'll get people with maybe social phobia, but also hoarding disorder. And when you're talking about how they categorize it, that was really interesting, because it is a little bit different to the anxiety disorders, but that underlying anxiety, that underlying fear, always makes for like common discussion.
And I think it is really nice that you know, have the doors open to people with, you know, obsessive compulsive unrelated disorders in anxiety space, because, you know, treatment is the same, and also just an opportunity to talk is always helpful. And yeah, so I think it is, regardless of the categorization, making sure that people with those disorders are still involved in the conversation is super important.
Thanks, Merrick.
Cool. Okay, well, I will keep going through. So PTSD, again, I'm sure you're quite aware of PTSD and what it involves. I'm going to have more of a kind of strict focus on the diagnostic criteria here, because I think a lot of people know probably what it is, but there's really specific parts of the diagnostic criteria that are important to cover here, I think. This is another disorder that was previously categorized as an anxiety disorder until the DSM-5, and now it is in trauma and stressor-related disorders. You can see here I've written there's many diagnostic criteria, and that's why I think it's good to cover them. But just kind of touching on that conversation that Rachel and I were just having, just because it's in a new category, it is still treated in quite a similar way. And again, I would encourage you to, use your anxiety knowledge to help, navigate conversations with people with PTSD who come to your support groups, because the treatment is still similar, and, it's still a really net positive for all involved to have people with PTSD involved in the conversation. So, if don't be too worried if, it's reflecting something that's not an anxiety disorder. It very much used to be categorized as one, and you can definitely still have conversations and feel comfortable leading a session in the same sort of way. It's one of the most common kind of anxiety disorders, as it was previously known. Obviously now it's its own category, but roughly 7% of people at any one time over a 12-month period experience PTSD, and this is obviously quite more than a lot of the ones we've spoken about today. When we look at the criteria, the first is about the stressor, and this is where we see the event that might have occurred to cause this particular disorder or trauma. And so the criteria suggests that the person was exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, either through directly experiencing it, witnessing it, learning that it happened to someone close to them, or if you have repeated extreme exposure to these sort of things. So, you can imagine emergency service personnel, people who have been in war type situations and so on. So it used to be only if it happened to you, it could be categorized, but now they have, increased, in, I think, a correct and sensitive way to include, it happening to people around you or witnessing it, and increasing the kind of range of events that can cause it. We talk about intrusion symptoms, and so one or more of the following must occur. These are unwanted, recurrent, distressing memories or recurrent distressing dreams related to the event, as well as what we call dissociative reactions, or also known as flashbacks, where a person feels like the event is, reoccurring and currently happening. Intense or prolonged distress when exposed to cues that symbolize the traumatic event as well. And so this is, the classic example is someone who has been at war, comes home and hears a plane taking off, and, has the really strong physiological response, a really strong kind of emotional response, cognitions of really awful things and really uncomfortable things. And so that's what we mean by kind of the intense or prolonged distress in the face of some of these cues. Other criteria include either avoiding internal reminders, so avoiding thoughts, avoiding feelings, avoiding memories, or external reminders and avoiding people, certain situations and places and so on. And so this this avoidance is persistent, I should say, much in a similar way to other anxieties and avoiding those situations. There's also the kind of negative impact on mood and cognitions, and you can see on the bottom half of this slide whether someone has inability to remember important aspects of the event, have kind of blocked them out. They have they started to have negative beliefs about themselves or the world as a result. They think they are now not as strong as they once were, or they're worthless now, or the world is an awful place now, is a really kind of common few examples of that. A lot of people might blame themselves or blame other people in a really excessive way for causing the trauma as a way of dealing with it. Increased negative affect or having a hard time experiencing positive affect, decreased interest in activities, or feeling detached from other people are other common ones. And so someone to meet the criteria must have 2 or more of those. We also have a criterion that looks at the kind of arousal and reactivity. So a lot, kind of physiological stuff here as well as emotional. So whether you're increased in irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, and so that is that, the kind of classic fight or flight response going into overdrive in any situation, internal or external, that could bring on a reminder or a potential stressor. Heightened startle reaction, which is kind of the physical form of hypervigilance, difficulty concentrating and difficulty sleeping here, and again, 2 or more of the following. Other requirements for PTSD include the symptoms lasting for more than a month. There are disorders that stipulate a kind of pre-PTSD. I actually can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, unfortunately, but there is a disorder that kind of mentions that period in between where you've been exposed to the traumatic event, but it hasn't quite been long enough to be PTSD. And yeah, symptoms must last more than a month, create distress or impairment, and they're not due to medication, substance use, or other illnesses. They can kind of be particularly mapped to the traumatic event. We mentioned depersonalization or derealization before when we're talking about panic attacks. And this is, again, another requirement and another common experience for people with PTSD. We also have the delayed specification here, where the full criteria might not be met until at least 6 months after the trauma, although the onset of symptoms may occur immediately. And that's, again, where these other disorders that kind of almost act as a kind of bridge between the event and the experience of the event to then becoming this post-event disorder that PTSD is. And so I don't have any information on those today, but they are in the DSM, and it's something that you can take a look at. And effectively, it's just the similar symptoms, similar things occurring, but obviously in a close enough proximity to the event that mean that it doesn't present as kind of post-event. So a lot of criteria there, and you can find that criteria online, but I thought it was kind of good to go through that, explain some of those in a little bit more detail. So hopefully that was useful. In terms of our treatment, one thing that's really, I suppose, unique in the treatment here is there's a lot of associated problems with PTSD: sleep disturbance, self-medication, drug and alcohol use, relationship difficulties, all really common. Not to say they're not common with other anxiety disorders as well, but it's something that we see really commonly with PTSD. So dealing with these associated problems is really important. And then using other kind of things we've spoken about, a cognitive restructuring, controlled exposure to the cues that people have been avoiding. Again, these can be either thoughts, memories, or physical places, sounds, objects, whatever it might be. So thinking about exposure both to internal and external cues here. Psychoeducation, again, really important, particularly surrounding, how long it's been since the event, why it might be still having an impact. People might think, oh, it's been ages, like, why can't I get over it? And you can say, well, it's actually really common, and often these things present more severe down the track, and here are the reasons why. So that's a really important part. And again, cognitive restructuring, helping people deal with the excessive self-blame, excessive blame of others, and helping navigate the thoughts about oneself having less worth, or the world being a worse place as a result, and helping people restructure some of those thoughts in a more positive or at least less negative way. Okay, so we've reached the point of summary. So I will go through a quick summary of everything we've covered, and then we'll open up the floor if anyone has any questions or wants to have a chat. But effectively, anxiety disorders are very common, very debilitating, and significantly interfere with a person's day-to-day functioning. When we talk about anxiety disorders as a kind of broad bracket, that's generally the way that we look at them. Someone has beyond normal anxiety if it significantly impacts their life in a detrimental way on a day-to-day basis, is effectively the language that we use when we're, talking about anxiety disorders as a whole. Of course, today we've seen that it's some quite slight and unique differences between the specific disorders, but that's generally the language that I would use. For example, when I'm doing small steps and explaining to someone who doesn't know what anxiety is, or when anxiety goes from beyond a normal response to something that might look like an anxiety disorder, that's the language I tend to use. Whilst anxiety disorders do persist if left untreated, they are very treatable generally with early intervention, and they do respond well to evidence-based interventions. Of course, we've spoken predominantly about CBT today, but we've also spoken about relaxation and mindfulness techniques, We've spoken about the use of SSRIs or other psychopharmacological interventions to, and again, using some of these things in conjunction can be the most powerful. So we can see here, combining CBT, mindfulness, and meditation practices and medications if deemed necessary is really, really effective. CBT has been shown to facilitate robust improvement for all anxiety disorders, again, especially when treatment is early. I'm not saying that CBT is the only way, and particularly for our people in the crowd who have finished counselling diplomas, you would have been exposed to many, many different types of therapy. The reason that we structured this in this way is because CBT has the most empirical evidence. However, using different parts of other therapies can be really powerful. You've got your interpersonal therapies, your narrative therapies, your acceptance and change therapy, things like that can all, I think, complement each other and be used in that powerful way. Of course, if you're qualified to deliver them, then you'll develop the knowledge of how to integrate these over time. But from a kind of research perspective, and very much where my world lies is a research perspective, we have to promote CBT as currently the best evidence-supported treatment for these sort of things. Internet or e-CBT is showing promise. Very little is known about its longer-term efficacy because there is, simply hasn't been around long enough to know. But we've even seen throughout COVID and stuff that people were successfully achieving therapeutic outcomes over the internet, be it through digital programs, Zoom therapy sessions, whatever it might be. We're starting to see some promise with internet treatment, which is really powerful because it opens up a whole new range of opportunities. It increases access to certain people who might not be able to get access previously. Obviously, there's still a lot of people who can't get access to stable internet, and that needs to improve for certain rural areas and stuff. So hopefully that's something that gets done in the next few years to get more people access, particularly people in remote regions, to this internet CBT or internet treatments generally to, give everyone the likelihood of navigating some of these anxiety disorders that we've spoken about today. It's good to note that these techniques and these therapies do also apply to other anxiety disorders we haven't spoken about today, things like separation anxiety. Again, really similar principles, that graded exposure, being sensitive, psychoeducation, and navigating the physical symptoms as well with our mindfulness and our breathing exercises and stuff like that. So whilst there are particular nuances to each disorder, there's these blanket things that we can apply to ones that we didn't get time to cover today as well. Awesome. So that is everything from the slides. And yeah, I'd like to hear any comments or questions or anything anyone wants to raise now. That would be awesome.
Yeah, Merrick, I'll just say that, thanks for kind of bucketing all that up for us in a nice, easy to understand kind of way. And it's, really interesting to see that, I suppose at the core of anxiety disorders, there are some similarities that, as facilitators being aware of these and being able to, not, need to know so much about the specific disorders themselves, but being able to just understand that they have a lot of similarities, and being able to kind of just be aware of that, I think, is important as for the roles that we'll be performing. So I wanted to thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and it's something that can be quite, I suppose, comforting and empowering as a facilitator is, I don't have to know the ins and outs of everything to get started. And by having that knowledge across the board and some of those things, I think is a really good tool to have. And then, if people have very specific needs and specific questions, that's something that you can navigate over time and work out. But coming in from that, real stable ground, I think is really nice. And I appreciate the thank you as well. Cheers.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyone else have any questions or things you wanted to have a chat about?
Thanks also for including PTSD in your presentation. There was a time, probably about 3-4 years ago, where people with PTSD were excluded from our groups, and I'm so happy now to say that they are allowed to come along to our groups. We do ask that they're at a stage with anyone, actually, that anyone is well enough to attend the groups, because we've found with the support groups, anxiety can be really closely related to trauma. We just, at the beginning of a group, and Karen and I'll talk about this next week too, we make sure that we make everyone aware that it's not a time to discuss traumatic events in detail, and that's something for them to talk to their therapist about. It's really hard to avoid triggering everybody to cover all bases. Some people will be triggered by all sorts of things, but we just sort of start the meeting with that, just in order to keep people safe and to be aware that there's going to be people in the room living with PTSD, but also people undiagnosed living with PTSD. So we just want to keep that a safe environment for everyone. So it was great to go through that and have a look at how it can affect people and how they can be triggered by different things. Peter Jolly is just trying to come in. I'm not sure if he's got mixed up with the times. I'm just going to let him. Anxiety disorder. I'll just let him in.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's okay.
Hello, Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Rachel. Hello.
Hello. So this session started at 10 a.m.
I just realised that. I've left you a voice message going, oops.
That's okay. So Mary gave us a rundown on the anxiety disorders, and there will be a recording of this session. We're just at the point now where he's gone through all the anxiety disorders and we're just asking questions. So if you have a question that you want to ask Merrick about any of the anxiety disorders, you're welcome to ask that now.
Yeah, thank you. That was without a bit of background, I don't think I've got a lot to ask for now. I'll look forward to the recording and I'll just join along with you to the end, if that's all right.
Yep, no worries at all. And after viewing the recording, if you've got any questions, I can contact Merrick and he'll follow up with those questions for you.
Fabulous.
So we're just about drawing to a close. Any other questions or comments or anything? I hope you found this this session useful, and it's given you more of an insight into what you might see in the groups as far as compulsions and those physical symptoms of anxiety, and a little bit of background to what is actually going on with that person that's sitting in that group with you.
Rachel, I might just say that, when we're in the group setting and people are, say, sharing how they're experiencing or coping with their anxiety or their condition, I suppose really the role of us as facilitators is just to kind of empathize and to thank and support and, I suppose I'll be resisting kind of trying to act as a therapist in some respects, just because that's not my role in this setting. But yeah, it will be interesting just to be able to, and I guess, is that the role of us as facilitators, is really there just to empathize and to promote a safe kind of conversation, of course, that really allows people to share and to others to comment and to kind of really build up the person, is really what we're trying to achieve in this setting. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, that's so true. You've summarized it really well. Thanks, Ben. So even though you might have a therapeutic background, you're not there as a therapist. You're there to encourage the sharing amongst the members. So always having that empathetic approach, and maybe Merrick's talking about how he can't get into a lift or something like that. And you might say, oh, Harley, I think you had a similar experience, and drawing those other people into the conversation. So it's all about people connecting with each other, and all about having that empathetic, non-judgmental environment. So the facilitator is responsible for those sort of things. But of course, having any clinical skills helps, because you can sort of suggest things. We're not in a therapy way. You might suggest, I listened to this great mindfulness thing, and I have heard about the research around mindfulness or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I could raise my hand. Could I ask a question around that?
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, so just along that line, would it be, I imagine it would be appropriate to just ask the question, has anyone had experience with mindfulness in this sort of situation? Has anyone used? So that would be how I'd like to pose things, would be more about asking questions of the group rather than giving them information straight up. Is that a good strategy?
Yeah, that's a great strategy, because it'll get the members sharing, feeling comfortable to share. So that's a great way, especially if there's a bit of a lull in the conversation. You might say, hey, has anyone tried mindfulness? I've heard that, that can be effective. What are your thoughts? And get that conversation really started. Thanks, Peter.
Terrific. Thank you.
I suppose having some access to resources to share, and having some good background knowledge, of course, would make us more effective facilitators. So that would be part of our learning journey, that as we go through it, and to enrich our own knowledge, and being able to point people in the right direction, or to be able to share from a more knowledgeable perspective, of course, is something that we'll gain in competence as we go forward, I would imagine. Yeah,
for sure. And you'll find people that come to the groups also have quite immense knowledge. They've been on quite a long journey, and they've got all sorts of things that they'll draw upon and discuss about. So it's all about people contributing and sharing. And Peter, did you want to ask another question?
I think it'd be rhetorical if I did, but I just wanted to say something along the lines of that. Now, I live with complex PTSD, and therefore anxiety is a part of that. And what I know is that every human has, starting at stress and on the spectrum up to a panic attack or anxiety. So I don't think there'd ever be anybody in a room of people talking about anxiety that wouldn't be able to have their own experience, even at a minor level, of how to deal with that. When life situations are threatening, or you're running out of time, or have a phobia of places or whatever. So, I really encourage everybody to be able to reflect on their own levels of what's the word I want to use? Heightened awareness or anxiety. Yeah. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's so true. I think Mary might have something to say about this as well. It's a normal, I don't know if you call it emotion, it's a normal state of being human to experience anxiety in some sort of level. Did you want to comment on that, Mary?
Yeah, and I think Peter makes a really good point. Everyone will definitely have a frame of reference. And I think, using the knowledge and sharing the knowledge that, we all have anxiety. We're biologically hardwired to have anxiety. Obviously, some of us, have it more than others. And there is a point where anxiety becomes beyond normal. And at the end of the presentation, I mentioned, that beyond normal anxiety looks like that significant day-to-day interruption that anxiety causes, and the significant day-to-day detrimental impact it has. But I think, just, the knowledge that everyone experiences it, and that we're supposed to experience it, we're built to experience it, is really empowering and really comforting for people. And I think, as you mentioned, reflecting on your own experiences, and, everyone having a frame of reference for this sort of thing is definitely something that I think is would be quite comforting for a group, for sure. think before I head off, Rachel, I was thinking, just not sure about people's level of knowledge or experience with things like relaxation techniques. So I'll just drop the Beyond Blue ones in the chat, which is a really good starting point for people. I'm sure, you know, everyone is at various points in their education, or some are finished. People probably know a great range of resources, but I thought just in case no one has somewhere to start, you can go from there. And then it's worth checking out things like, you know, things like Smiling Mind for younger people, things like the Calm app for older people. You can look at other institutes around, like Black Dog for different stuff. You can, look at a variety of different resources, but there are some good places to start in case people don't have any on hand.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Marek. That's a great thing to add to this presentation, actually, a few little tools from reputable organisations that people can have a look at and also tell the members of the group about. We talk a lot about anxiety disorders. In our support groups, we welcome anyone experiencing anxiety, so they don't have to be diagnosed with a disorder. They can just have what I call, this is probably not a clinical term, I call it situational anxiety. So maybe they're going through a rough period. Maybe they're extremely anxious over financial matters or relationships or something like that, and it's only periodic. They're still welcome to come to our groups, and they do benefit a lot because we've got members there that have been on that journey and have got some really great skills and strategies. So even if they're not diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, or they haven't been experiencing anxiety for a long time, they're still welcome to attend our groups. Peter, is your hand up?
Aren't you glad I came late?
Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to add to the resource list. There's so many great apps out there. I've got an app for block breathing and other breathing meditations, and there's Mentalopia or something. Anyway, there's such a host of great apps available for people to use as well. And yeah, I hope people can source those easy enough. I can certainly tell anyone about the multitude I have if they'd like.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, it's interesting. There's been quite an explosion in that sort of stuff, hasn't there? Quite accessible to everyone now, which is really great, and pointing people in the right direction is really helpful.
I think, just double checking that they're reputable, double checking that they're, evidence-based and those sort of things is great where you can. And if people bring up new ones in the group that you haven't heard of, it's worth jotting it down and taking a quick look when you get home, and just making sure that it's doing all the things that we know that they should be doing, and that sort of stuff as well. I think is another good one to know. I don't think anyone is creating mindfulness or relaxation apps to be cynical, and I'm not suggesting that there's dodgy ones out there, but it's always worth double checking, I think, is an important point.
Also, some of our groups, the facilitators do practice a mindfulness session, or like a small meditation or relaxation session during the group, but it's really important, if you're going to do that, you check in with the members, because it's not suitable for everyone. I don't like to generalize about people, but I have found people with OCD are not very comfortable with those sort of exercises. I don't know if that's because of the intrusive thoughts, and Marek might have an insight into that, but you've really got to check in and don't think, as also like with art therapy, that's a very common thing, that everyone with anxiety is comfortable with those techniques. So by all means, promote those techniques, but they might not always be suitable to be done in the group.
Yeah, they're very much a muscle that needs to be trained, much like exposure and much like some of the other things we do. So it can be difficult and sometimes detrimental for people to jump straight into long mindfulness if they're not ready, and still dealing with difficult things. So definitely good to understand where people are at and make sure that it's appropriate.
So any other questions or comments or anything? We might wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming along, and our next session will be next Tuesday afternoon. I'll send out a reminder. And a big thank you to Merrick for your time. Thank you so much for all the wonderful things you do for Wayahead. And it's so great to have you on board and all that knowledge that you bring, and just for being so approachable and taking the time to spend with our new volunteers. So thank you.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, and nice to meet everyone. All the best with the next few stages of the training.
Yeah, thanks, Merrick.
Ditto, and thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Awesome. See you all.